getting heavy.
Hi.
The camera's up there. Say hi, Caleb.
Hi, Caleb.
Marcus, Tristan, AJ, Aaron, and Sierra. We're reading chapter 16 today. There's only 2 chapters left. And then on to Magician. Right. And then we're on to Magician's Nephew.
I don't know what to say.
This is what happened.
I did not hit myself.
What?
I did not hit myself. I look like
Oh,
I did.
okay. Chapter 16, what happened about the statues. What an extraordinary place, Lucy cried. All those stone animals and people, too. It looks like a museum.
Oh, okay.
Like a museum.
Like a museum?
But it's more like a prison.
Oh.
Because the White Witch kept her. Yeah, turned people into statues and kept them there. Really? That wouldn't be very nice, would it? Hush, said Susan. Aslan is doing something. He was indeed. Aslan is the big lion.
Well, what is he doing?
Well, that's what we're going to find out if you let me read.
Okay.
Okay. He was indeed. He bounded up to the stone lion, and he breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you may remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone rabbit on his right, and then rushed on to 2 centaurs. But at that moment Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion. I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper, which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire."
Ooh.
And for a second, nothing seemed to have happened. And then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back. Then it spread, and then the color seemed to lick all over him as a flame licks over a bit of paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisked around him, whimpering with delight, jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. Everywhere the statues were coming to life.
Really?
They were.
How is that possible?
It's not really. It's magic.
It's not? Well, why when they breathed on Aslan?
Well, it's when Aslan breathed on them, because his breath was magical. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum. It looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around.
Oh my gosh!
Oh my gosh, what?
How were they dancing around?
It's a little over the top, don't you think? The creatures were running around Aslan and dancing around him until he almost was hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white courtyard, now was a blaze of colors. Glossy chestnut. You know what? You distract me and I lose my place.
Okay.
Try to settle down a little bit. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, the reddy brown of foxes, dogs, and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarves, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings and yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone. Look, is it safe? Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of a stone giant. It's all right, shouted Aslan joyously. Once the feet are put right, all the rest of them will follow. That isn't exactly what I meant, whispered Susan to Lucy. But it was too late to do anything about it now, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later he lifted his club off his shoulder and rubbed his eyes. And he said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now where's that dratted little witch that was running around on the ground?"
What? Why was she running around on the ground?
Because he was obviously in a fight with her, and she turned him into stone, and he doesn't remember anything else. But when everyone shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again, so at last he understood, then he bowed down his head till his head was no further off the top of a haystack, and touching his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1 you've never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. I would say so.
What? Well, I got a Gyarados in Pokemon Go. I know you guys have never played that, but it has a really good attack, which is called Hyper Beam.
Okay. Now for the inside of the house, said Aslan. Look alive, everyone. Upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched.
Got him.
You never know where some poor prisoner might be concealed.
Got him as a Pokemon.
And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows and with everyone's voices crying out at once. Don't forget the dungeons. Give us a hand with this door. Here's another little winding stair. Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo. Call Aslan. Whew, it smells in here. Look out for the trapdoors. Up there. There are a whole lot more on the landing. But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs shouting, Aslan! Aslan! I found Mr. Tumnus. Oh, do come quick. A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing around and around for joy. Hey. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and of course was very interested in all that she had to tell him. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly.
What are you doing?
You're hyper, aren't you? Did you drink Cuban coffee?
Where's Cuban coffee?
I guess not. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, But how are we going to get out? For Aslan had got in by a jump, and the gates were still locked. That'll be all right, said Aslan, and then rising on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. Hi, you up there, he roared. What's your name? Giant Rumblebuffin, if it please you, your honor, said the giant, once more touching his cap. Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin, said Aslan, just let us get out of this, will you? Certainly, your honor, it would be a pleasure, said Giant Rumblebuffin. Stand well away from the gates, all of you little ones. Then he strode to the gate itself and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing there in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap all the grass and the waving trees and the sparkling streams of the forest and the blue hills, and beyond them the sky. Blowed if I ain't all in a muck sweat, said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. Comes of being out of condition, I suppose. Neither of you young ladies has such a thing in your pocket as a handkerchief, do you? Yes, I have, said Lucy, standing on the tiptoes and holding up her handkerchief as far as she could. What did Lucy do?
I don't know.
You weren't listening.
Why did I have to listen?
Well, that's the whole point of me reading a story to you.
Well, why does it have
Who
to
broke down the gate?
Aslan, dude?
No, the giant did. You weren't paying attention. Now the giant's sweating, and what did he ask for?
Water?
A handkerchief.
Oh.
You weren't listening at all. And what's the giant's name? Giant Rumblebuffin. Thank you, Missy, said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. The next moment, Lucy got a rather fright, for she found herself caught up in midair between the giant's finger and thumb. What happened to Lucy?
Lucy,
She got picked up by the giant.
okay.
But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, "Bless me, I've picked up a little girl. Instead, I beg your pardon, Missy. I thought you was the handkerchief." "No, no," said Lucy, laughing. "Here it is." This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him as a saccharin tablet would be to you.
How big was the handkerchief?
It was a normal-sized human handkerchief, but he's a giant. "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "Not at all, not at all," said the giant politely. "Never met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it." "What a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," said the fawn. All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was. But an old family with traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, she never would have turned him into stone. At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. "Our day's work is not yet over," he said. "If the witch is finally to be defeated before bedtime, we must join the battle at once." "And join in, I hope, sir?" asked the largest of the centaurs. "Of course," said Aslan. "And now, those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarfs, and small animals, must ride on the backs of those who can, that is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, and giants and eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in front of us, lions. Come in front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves." And with a great deal of bustle and cheering they did, and the most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere and pretending to be very busy, but in order really to say to everyone he met, "Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions. That meant him and me." At least he went on saying this until Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarfs, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him for a bit. When all was ready, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan the most in getting them sorted out into their proper order. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first the lions and dogs went nosing in all directions, but then suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others streaked out behind for a half a mile, were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then with the music of the hounds was mixed the roar of the other lion, and sometimes the far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went as the scent became easier and easier for them to follow. And then at last they came to a curve in a narrow winding valley. Lucy heard above all those noises another noise, a different one, which gave her a queer feeling inside. It was a noise of shouts and shrieks, of the clashing metal against metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now, in the daylight, they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There was also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield. So apparently the witch had been using her wand, but she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's swords flashing so quickly that they looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair were in the center. On each side the line stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. And then with a roar that shook all Narnia, from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the white witch. Lucy saw her face lifted toward him for 1 second, with an expression of terror and amazement. Then the lion and the witch rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and at the same time all the warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines. Dwarves with their battle axes, dogs with teeth, the giant with his club, and his feet also crushed dozens of the foe. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs with swords and hooves, and Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered until the woods echoed with the din of that onset. That ends chapter 16. We have one more chapter to go, chapter 17, which is the hunt of the white stag.
I'm sorry I wasn't there for
Come here. You want to say goodbye? Look at the camera. The camera's right up here. Stand over here to work better.
Bye.
Bye who? Who are you saying goodbye to?
Bye, everyone.
Everyone. That kind of covers it all, doesn't it? Okay, see you next time.
Bye. And I'm sorry I wasn't in this for the whole video.
He got distracted.